Picture this. A woman kneels in the dirt outside her own home. Her back is bare. The first stroke of the Roman whip opens her skin from shoulder blade to hip. She doesn't scream. Not yet. The soldiers laugh at her silence. They think it's pride. They don't understand that she's counting the men, counting the strokes, counting the seconds until she can watch them die. The second stroke crosses the first. Blood runs down her spine, pooling in the dust. The crowd gathered around her, her own people forced to watch, go silent. Some look away, most can't. This is the point. This is always the point. Humiliation requires an audience. By the 10th stroke, her knees buckle. By the 20th, she's face down in the dirt, breathing mud and blood. But the Romans aren't finished. They were never going to be finished with just the whip. They drag her daughters forward. The girls are young, teenagers, old enough to understand what's about to happen, young enough that it will destroy them. The soldiers don't hurry. They want the mother to watch. They want the tribe to watch. They want everyone to understand what happens when Rome decides to take what it wants. The screaming starts. It echoes across the settlement, high animal sounds that don't seem human. The mother tries to rise, but a soldier's boot pins her to the ground. She can hear everything. The grunting of the soldiers, the tearing of fabric, the pleading that eventually stops because pleading never works. When it's over, and it takes a long time to be over, the Romans walk away laughing. They leave the woman bleeding in the dirt. They leave her daughters curled together, silent now, staring at nothing. They don't bother killing anyone. Death would be mercy. This is punishment. The woman's name is Boudica. She is queen of the Iceni tribe. Her husband has been dead for less than a month, and every Roman who touched her daughters has perhaps 18 months left to live. She will hunt them. She will find them. And when she's finished, 70,000 people will be dead. 3 cities will be ash, and Rome will face the greatest crisis its British province has ever known. But that comes later. For now, she lies in the dirt, tasting blood, and makes a promise that history will never forget. The question isn't whether she'll get her revenge. The question is, how does a queen become a monster, and does Rome deserve what's coming? The smell of her husband's funeral pyre still hung in the air when the Roman procurator's men arrived. Prasutagus had been clever. For 17 years he'd kept his kingdom intact by bending just enough. He paid tribute. He smiled at Roman officials. He named the emperor co-heir to his lands alongside his daughters. It was insurance, a legal arrangement that should have protected his family after his death. The Romans would get half. His daughters would keep half. Everyone would be satisfied. He died believing his family was safe. He was wrong. Gaius Decianus, the procurator of Britain, saw the will not as a legal document but as an invitation. If Rome was entitled to half, why not take all? The Iceni were wealthy. Their lands were fertile, their storehouses were full of grain, their fields thick with cattle. And now their king was dead, leaving only a widow and 2 girls. What were they going to do about it? The procurator's men came with lists, tax assessments that tripled overnight. Debts that had never existed before suddenly demanded immediate payment. Roman merchants who had extended credit to Iceni nobles during the good years now called in every loan at once, with interest calculated in ways that made repayment impossible. Historians still debate whether Gaius Decianus acted on orders from Rome or simply saw an opportunity for personal enrichment. The evidence suggests both. Nero's government was hungry for provincial wealth, and Britain had been expensive to conquer. Every gold talk stripped from an Iceni noble, every grain shipment seized from tribal stores, every acre of farmland transferred to Roman veterans, it all flowed upward, a percentage skimmed at every level. The dispossession was systematic. Roman officers arrived at the homes of Iceni aristocrats and announced that their estates now belonged to the emperor. Men who had fought alongside Rome, who had kept their oaths of alliance for 2 decades, found themselves homeless overnight. Their children were seized as collateral for fictional debts. Their wives were assigned to Roman households as servants. The tribal council sent messengers to protest. The messengers didn't return. Boudica tried diplomacy. She travelled to Camulodunum, Colchester, the new Roman capital, to appeal directly to the authorities. She brought gifts. She brought documents proving her husband's agreements with Rome. She brought her daughters, dressed in their finest clothes, hoping that the sight of the legitimate heirs might remind someone of honour. The meeting lasted less than an hour. The officials laughed at her documents, they confiscated her gifts, and then, because she had dared to question Roman authority, they decided to make an example. The flogging happened in public, the rapes happened in public, and when it was over, Boudica was thrown out of the city with a warning, caused trouble, and next time they'd kill the girls instead of just using them. She walked home. It took 3 days. She didn't speak the entire journey, but she listened. At every settlement she passed, she heard the same stories. Farms seized, children taken, men beaten for refusing to surrender their weapons. The Iceni weren't the only tribe suffering. The Trinovantes to the south had been crushed for years, their best land given to Roman veterans, their young men conscripted as labour for building projects that glorified their conquerors. The rage was everywhere, it just needed a spark. Boudica returned to what remained of her household and called a council. The tribal elders came expecting grief. They found something else entirely. The woman who stood before them wasn't broken. She was cold, focused. Every word she spoke was calculated. Rome had taken everything legal. They had violated everything sacred. There was nothing left to protect by staying peaceful. She asked one question: are the Iceni still warriors, or have we become Roman cattle? The answer came back unanimous. Within a week, messengers were riding to every tribe in eastern Britain. Within a month, the largest native army since the conquest would be gathering in the forests. And Rome, confident in its superiority, noticed nothing until cities started burning. The system had created its own destruction. It just didn't know it yet. 3 weeks after the flogging, a Roman tax collector disappeared near Iceni territory. His body was never found. His escort, 4 soldiers, were discovered in a ditch, throats cut, weapons missing. Rome sent investigators. The investigators vanished too. This was how it started. Not with a declaration of war, but with silence. Men who entered Iceni lands simply stopped coming back. Trade caravans that once moved freely now found roads blocked by fallen trees and bridges mysteriously collapsed. Roman merchants who had grown fat on British grain suddenly couldn't find anyone willing to sell to them. The message was clear: the border was closed. Boudica had learned from watching Rome. She understood that power required organisation. Rage alone accomplished nothing. It burned hot and fast and left only ash. What she needed was rage with direction, rage with logistics, rage that could sustain itself long enough to accomplish something permanent. She sent her most trusted warriors as ambassadors, not to demand alliance but to share stories. They carried no weapons, only words. They visited the Trinovanti first, the tribe that had suffered longest under Roman occupation. They described what had been done to Boudica's daughters. They described it in detail. The Trinovanti didn't need convincing, they needed permission. For 20 years they had watched Roman veterans carve up their ancestral lands. They had built Camulodunum with their own hands, a city that celebrated their defeat, complete with a massive temple to the deified Emperor Claudius that mocked their old gods. Every day they walked past monuments to their own subjugation. Every year the temple priest demanded more contributions for festivals that glorified conquest. When Boudica's messengers asked if they would fight, the Trinovantes asked only one question: when do we start? The Cortani joined next, then the Dobuni, then smaller tribes whose names history has forgotten, but whose anger was just as real. Each messenger returned with the same report. The countryside was ready to explode. All it needed was a leader. Boudica gave them one. She established her command in a sacred grove, away from Roman eyes. Warriors arrived in small groups, filtering through forests along paths the Romans had never mapped. They brought their own weapons, mostly hunting spears and farming tools converted for war, but Boudica's smiths worked day and night, hammering out swords from any metal available. Historians still debate whether Boudica was a military genius or simply the right person at the right moment. The evidence suggests something between the two. She understood that her army's greatest strength was numbers, and her greatest weakness was discipline. Roman legions won battles through formation and training. British warriors fought as individuals seeking personal glory. Trying to make them fight like Romans would fail. She needed to use what they were. Her strategy was simple: avoid pitched battles against organised legions, strike where Rome was weak, burn what Rome had built, kill everyone who collaborated. The first target was obvious. Camulodunum had no walls. The veterans who had retired there were old, fat, and hadn't held a sword in years. The Temple of Claudius dominated the skyline, a symbol of everything the tribes hated. And the nearest legion was 200 miles away, chasing druids on the island of Mona. The timing couldn't have been better. In the days before the attack, strange things happened. At least the Romans later called them strange. The statue of victory in Camulodunum fell over for no apparent reason, and fell backwards, as if fleeing from an approaching enemy. Women in the streets began screaming prophecies of destruction. The sea at the harbour mouth supposedly turned the colour of blood. Historians still debate whether these omens were real, exaggerated in hindsight, or Roman attempts to excuse their failure by claiming divine intervention. What's certain is that the veterans of Camulodunum received multiple warnings that something was wrong. They requested reinforcements from Gaius Decianus, the same procurator whose greed had started the entire crisis. He sent 200 men to defend a city against an army that would number over 100,000. It was either criminal negligence or deliberate sacrifice. Either way, the people of Camulodunum had been written off before the first British warrior crossed their boundaries. The attack came at dawn, and what happened next would make Rome tremble for the first time since Hannibal crossed the Alps. The city had 2 days left to exist. The sound reached Camulodunum before the army did, a low rumble, like distant thunder, except the sky was clear. Then the shaking started. The ground itself seemed to vibrate as 100,000 feet moved in unison toward the city. The veterans gathered at the forum, clutching weapons they hadn't used in decades. Some still wore their old armour, leather straps cracked and bronze green with neglect. They formed a line, because that's what Romans did. They formed lines. But there weren't enough of them to defend even one street, let alone an entire city. The 200 reinforcements from the procurator stood with them. Professional soldiers at least, but their faces showed what their training couldn't hide. They could count. They could see the dust cloud on the horizon. They knew what was coming. The first wave hit the outskirts at mid-morning. There was no siege, no negotiation, no demand for surrender. British warriors simply flowed through the streets like water through broken fingers. They came from every direction at once, overwhelming the scattered defenders through sheer mass. The veterans died hard. They were Roman soldiers after all, even if their best days were behind them. Small groups held intersections for minutes, sometimes hours, buying time for civilians to flee toward the temple. But there was nowhere to flee to. The Britons had surrounded the city completely. Every road out led to death. By noon, the fighting had compressed to a single building, the Temple of Claudius. The temple was never designed as a fortress, but its stone walls were thick and its bronze doors were heavy. Several hundred Romans, soldiers, veterans, civilians, slaves who had thrown their lot in with their masters, barricaded themselves inside. They had food for perhaps a week. They had water from a small cistern. They had hope that somehow, somewhere, a legion was marching to save them. No legion was coming. Outside, Boudica's army settled in to wait. They didn't need to storm the temple, they just needed patience. Some warriors amused themselves by executing prisoners within earshot of the barricaded doors. The screaming lasted for hours. Others set fire to everything that would burn, filling the sky with smoke so thick that the sun turned red. The temple held for 2 days. Historians still debate whether the defenders attempted a breakout or simply ran out of options. What's certain is that on the second night, the Britons breached the doors. Some accounts say they used a battering ram. Others claim they simply piled wood against the entrance and let fire do the work. The bronze doors, superheated, eventually warped enough to create gaps. The killing inside was methodical. The Britons took no prisoners. They made no exceptions for age, gender, or status. The temple that had been built to honour a Roman god became a slaughterhouse dedicated to British rage. Blood pooled on marble floors. Bodies were dragged outside and arranged in patterns that mocked Roman order. According to Tacitus, the Britons did not practice normal warfare. They didn't take slaves. They didn't hold captives for ransom. They couldn't wait to cut throats, hang, burn, and crucify. This wasn't an army fighting for territory. This was an entire people extracting payment for decades of humiliation. The smell of burning flesh mixed with incense from the temple stores, creating a sickly sweet fog that hung over the ruins for days. Warriors walked through the destruction collecting trophies. Roman military decorations, jewellery stripped from corpses, the heads of officers mounted on spears. Boudica herself entered the temple only after the killing was done. According to later accounts, she walked through the carnage in silence, stepping over bodies without looking down. When she reached the altar, still splattered with blood that wasn't from sacrifices, she reportedly smiled for the first time since the flogging. 1 city down, 2 more to go. The army barely paused before moving again. They had momentum now, and momentum in war is everything. Refugees fleeing Camulodunum spread terror ahead of them, describing horrors that grew with each retelling. By the time word reached Londinium, the British army had swelled even further. Every oppressed farmer, every dispossessed noble, every man who had ever been cheated by a Roman merchant, they all flowed toward Boudica's banner. She didn't make them soldiers. She didn't have time. She just pointed them at the next city and let hatred do the rest. Londinium was larger than Camulodunum, richer, more populated. It would burn just as easily. Gaius Suetonius Paulinus received the news while standing on a beach covered with corpses. He had just finished the conquest of Mona, modern Anglesey, the sacred island of the Druids. His legions had waded through the shallows under a hail of curses from wild-haired priests and screaming women who looked more like furies than humans. They had slaughtered everyone they found, cut down the sacred groves, and thrown the Druid priesthood into their own sacrificial fires. It was supposed to be the final blow against British resistance. Instead, it was the worst timing in Roman military history. The messenger's report was 3 days old by the time it reached him. Camulodunum had fallen. The 9th Legion, sent from Lincoln to relieve the city, had been ambushed and virtually destroyed. The legate Quintus Petilius Cerialis had escaped with his cavalry, but his infantry was gone. 2,000 Roman soldiers butchered in a single afternoon. Paulinus didn't hesitate. He abandoned Mona immediately, leaving the Druids' ashes to cool without supervision. He took his cavalry and rode ahead of his infantry, covering ground at a pace that killed horses. He needed to see Londinium. He needed to see what could be saved. What he saw when he arrived was chaos. The city was pandemonium. Merchants loading carts with everything they could carry, families fighting over space on boats heading down the Thames. The streets choked with refugees fleeing south, colliding with refugees fleeing north, nobody knowing which direction led to safety because safety no longer existed anywhere. The city council begged him to stay. They fell at his feet. They offered him money, supplies, their own sons as soldiers. They pointed to the warehouses full of grain, the treasury, the thousands of citizens who had built their lives under Roman protection. Paulinus listened. Then he made his calculations. Londinium had no walls, no fortifications, no legion to defend it. His cavalry numbered perhaps 1,000 men. The British army, according to reports, exceeded 100,000. Even if his infantry arrived in time, which it wouldn't, he'd be outnumbered 10 to 1 in open streets. He looked at the city council and said 2 words: evacuate immediately. Then he turned and rode out. Historians still debate whether Paulinus made the right decision. Militarily, there was no other choice. A commander who wastes his army on hopeless defence serves no one. Morally, he condemned tens of thousands of civilians to death. The old, the sick, the stubborn, the poor who had nothing to flee with and nowhere to flee to, he left them all. Those who could escape did. Those who couldn't watched the Roman cavalry disappear down the road and understood what that meant. The British army arrived 3 days later. The attack on Londinium made Camulodunum look restrained. The city was larger, the population denser, the potential for atrocity greater. Boudica's warriors swept through the streets like a flood through a valley, and the water was red. According to Tacitus, the same rules applied. No prisoners, no slaves, no ransoms. The Britons couldn't wait to cut throats, hang, burn and crucify. Archaeologists have since found a thick layer of burnt debris beneath modern London, a destruction layer that tells its own story. Mixed in with the ash are human remains, scattered and incomplete, showing signs of violence that matches the written accounts. The smell must have been indescribable. Tens of thousands of bodies, burning buildings, summer heat. The smoke would have been visible for miles, a black column marking where a city used to stand. Boudica herself reportedly presided over rituals at the sacred grove of Andraste, the British goddess of victory. Tacitus describes prisoners being impaled, burned, and subjected to tortures that he refuses to detail because they were too obscene for Roman readers. Modern historians interpret this as possible religious sacrifice, offerings to the gods who had delivered such overwhelming success. But success was creating its own problems. The army had grown too large to feed efficiently. Warriors who had arrived expecting quick glory were now dragging families and livestock behind them. The logistical tail stretched for miles, and with every city burned, there was less to plunder. Boudica had unleashed something she might not be able to control. Still, there was one more city on the list. Verulamium, modern St Albans, was smaller than Londinium but symbolically important. It was a native British town that had embraced Roman ways, a collaborator city, a traitor city. It would burn hottest of all. Verulamium knew what was coming. Unlike Camulodunum and Londinium, they had days of warning. Refugees streamed through their gates with stories that grew more horrifying with each telling. The Britons were demons. They drank blood. They wore Roman skulls as helmets. The reality was worse because it was human. The town council faced an impossible choice. They could flee, abandon everything their families had built over decades of cooperation with Rome, or they could stay and hope that somehow, being British themselves, they might be spared. Most fled. The wealthy loaded wagons and headed south toward the Channel, hoping to buy passage to Gaul. The middle classes followed on foot, carrying what they could. By the time Boudica's army reached the outskirts, Verulamium was half empty. The half that remained learned that collaboration was not forgiven. If anything, the Britons hated Verulamium more than the Roman cities. These weren't foreign conquerors, these were their own people who had chosen Roman ways, who had adopted Roman dress and Roman gods and Roman laws. Traitors. The executions at Verulamium had a personal quality that the massacres at Londinium lacked. Tacitus doesn't describe Verulamium in detail. He simply notes that it fell like the others, but archaeology fills the gaps. The destruction layer is thinner here. Fewer people to kill, fewer buildings to burn, but the violence was just as absolute. The town that had spent decades trying to be Roman enough to matter was erased in a single afternoon. Total Roman and provincial dead across all three cities, 70,000, perhaps 80,000. Numbers so large they become abstract. Enough corpses to fill a modern sports stadium, enough blood to turn the Thames red for miles downstream. Boudica had accomplished something unprecedented. In the space of weeks, she had inflicted more casualties on Rome than any enemy since Hannibal. She had destroyed 3 major settlements, eliminated an entire legion's infantry, and sent the provincial government fleeing for their lives. The procurator Catus Decianus, the man whose greed had started everything, had already abandoned Britain entirely, sailing to Gaul before the flames of Londinium had cooled. But here's where everything changed. Historians still debate whether Boudica made a strategic error or simply ran out of options. After Verulamium, her army could have dispersed. They could have melted back into the countryside, taken their plunder, and dared Rome to find them. Guerrilla warfare against Roman logistics might have bled the occupation for years. Instead, she chose to fight. Perhaps she had no choice. The army had grown beyond her control, 100,000 warriors, plus families, plus camp followers, all expecting more victory, more glory, more revenge. You can't send that many people home without giving them something to show for it. You can't tell them the revolution is over when Roman soldiers still breathe on British soil. Perhaps she believed her own success. 3 cities destroyed, tens of thousands dead. Rome had to be broken. One more victory, a decisive battle against whatever legions Paulinus had scraped together, and the occupation would collapse entirely. Perhaps she simply wanted to finish what she'd started. Whatever the reason, Boudica led her army northwest, following the road toward Paulinus's position. She brought everyone, warriors, families, children, wagons loaded with plunder, herds of captured cattle. The column stretched for miles, a moving nation rather than a military force. It was exactly what Paulinus wanted. While Boudica was burning cities, the Roman governor had been preparing. He'd linked up with the 14th Legion and a detachment of the 20th. He'd sent messages to the 2nd Legion at Exeter, ordering them north. Messages the 2nd's acting commander, a prefect named Peneus Postumus, inexplicably ignored. But even without the 2nd, Paulinus had assembled roughly 10,000 soldiers, 10,000 against 100,000. Suicide odds if the battle was fought on open ground. Paulinus had no intention of fighting on open ground. He found his killing fields somewhere in the Midlands, the exact location lost to history. A narrow defile with dense forest on both sides and rising ground behind. A position where numbers meant nothing and discipline meant everything. He positioned his legions and waited. The largest single-day slaughter in British history was about to begin. The morning mist hadn't lifted when the first British scouts reported back. The Romans were waiting in a narrow valley, their lines drawn up in perfect formation, their standards catching the early light. Behind them, thick forest. On either side, steep wooded slopes. In front, a gradual incline that any attacking force would have to climb. It was a trap. Anyone could see it was a trap. Boudica's war chiefs argued for caution. Go round, find another route, force the Romans to abandon their position and fight in the open, where British numbers would overwhelm their formations. The argument was sound. It was also ignored. The army wouldn't wait. 100,000 warriors, blooded now, confident, hungry for the final victory, demanded battle. They had destroyed 3 cities. They had butchered a legion. They had watched the greatest empire in the world run from them. Fear was something that happened to other people. Boudica addressed them from her chariot, her daughters beside her. According to Tacitus, she drove through the ranks, reminding them why they fought. She was not there as a queen avenging her kingdom, she said, but as a woman of the people avenging her liberty, her tortured body, and the violated honour of her daughters. Roman greed had gone so far that nothing remained unpolluted. Not age, not maidenhood, not anything sacred. She pointed to her daughters. Everyone knew what had been done to them. The army roared its answer. Behind the British lines, something unprecedented was happening. The warriors had brought their families to watch the final victory. Wagons formed a massive semicircle at the rear. Women, children, elderly, all positioned like spectators at an arena. They would witness the destruction of Roman power in Britain. They would tell the story to their grandchildren. They would witness something, but not what they expected. Paulinus gave his own speech, shorter than Boudica's. He reminded his men that they faced a mob, not an army. More women than warriors in that mass, he said. Once they felt Roman steel, they would break. Keep your ranks. Trust your training. Let them come to you. The legions beat their swords against their shields. The sound echoed off the valley walls, a rhythmic thunder that announced what Rome did best. The ground between the armies measured perhaps 400 yards, gently sloping upward toward the Roman position. Open enough for a charge, narrow enough that only a fraction of the British force could engage at once. Boudica must have known. She must have seen how the terrain compressed her numbers, how only her front ranks could actually fight, while the masses behind them simply pushed forward uselessly. But the army was already moving. The decision had been made. The charge began. Historians still debate whether a more disciplined force could have broken the Roman line even in that disadvantageous position. The British had numbers that should have been overwhelming. If they'd hit the Romans in organised waves, rotating fresh warriors to the front, using their mass to sustain pressure, perhaps. Instead, they charged as individuals, each warrior seeking personal glory, the fastest reaching the Roman shields far ahead of any support. They hit the line and stopped. The Roman formation didn't buckle, didn't bend, didn't waver. Shields interlocked, the legionaries absorbed the impact, then began their work. Short swords, gladi, stabbed out between shields, punching into groins, throats, armpits. Efficient, mechanical. Each thrust took a life. The warriors behind the front rank couldn't see what was happening. They pushed forward, compressing the men ahead of them against the Roman wall. The crush intensified. Men at the front couldn't raise their arms to swing their long swords. Men in the middle couldn't retreat because of the pressure behind them. Men at the back kept pushing, feeding more bodies into the grinder. The killing was industrial. Bodies piled up along the Roman line, creating barriers that the next wave had to climb over. Blood turned the slopes slick. The smell of opened bowels filled the valley. And still the Romans held, stabbing, killing, stepping over the dead to meet the next victim. Time lost meaning. An hour, 2 hours. The sun climbed overhead and began its descent, and the line of British dead grew higher. Something had to break. Nothing broke like this forever. The Romans took a breath, dressed their lines, and attacked. The Roman counterattack came in a wedge formation, a triangle of armoured death that punched into the exhausted British centre like a fist through rotten wood. The legionaries had waited for this moment. Hours of defensive slaughter had drained British momentum, clogged the field with corpses, and created panic in warriors who had never faced anything but victory. Now the Romans advanced, and the retreat became a rout. The front ranks tried to run, the middle ranks didn't know what was happening, the rear ranks were still pushing forward. The collision of these three movements created a chaos that had no name, men climbing over each other, trampling each other, crushing each other against the pressure that came from every direction at once. Roman cavalry swept around the flanks. Auxiliary troops, Gauls, Batavians, men who had their own reasons to hate rebellious natives, drove into the gaps. The British formation, which had never really been a formation, dissolved into 100,000 individuals all trying to survive, and then they hit the wagons, the spectators' gallery, the wives and children and elderly who had come to watch the triumph. Their wagons formed a wall at the rear of the battlefield, a wall that now blocked the only escape route. The fleeing warriors crashed into their own families. Women screamed as thousands of panicked men surged against the wooden barriers. Children were crushed beneath the stampede. The elderly who couldn't move fast enough were trampled into the mud. Behind the refugees came the Romans. Historians still debate whether what happened next was battlefield necessity or deliberate massacre. Tacitus makes no distinction. The Romans killed everyone. Warriors, women, children, pack animals, even the oxen pulling the wagons, all slaughtered without discrimination. The army's fury, so long restrained behind their shields, exploded into something total. The sound defied description. Not the clash of battle anymore, there was no battle left, but the sustained scream of mass death. Thousands of voices rising and falling, some cut short by Roman blades, others continuing until throats gave out. The splash and squelch of feet moving through blood-soaked ground. The wet crunch of bones beneath hooves. A Roman soldier who survived that day, his account lost, referenced only in later histories, reportedly said he couldn't hear properly for weeks afterward. The screaming had damaged something deep in his ears, or perhaps in his mind. The killing continued until sunset, and beyond. Roman torches flickered across the field as soldiers methodically worked through the heaps of wounded, finishing what the battle had started. No prisoners, no mercy. An entire people's dream of freedom extinguished one throat at a time. When dawn came, the battlefield had become something that didn't look like Earth. Bodies covered the ground so completely that the soil wasn't visible. Corpses lay 5 deep in places where the crush had been worst. The wagon semicircle had become a butcher's display, human remains tangled with animal carcasses and shattered wood. Crows were already gathering, their calls the only sound in a silence so profound it seemed to press against the ears. Tacitus records the casualties with Roman precision, 80,000 Britons dead. Roman losses numbered 400, with a slightly larger number wounded. The disparity seems impossible until you understand what happened. This wasn't a battle. This was the systematic destruction of an army that couldn't retreat, couldn't surrender, and couldn't escape. Boudica was not among the dead. She had watched the disaster from a distance, according to most accounts. When the rout began, when the wagons became a death trap, she turned her chariot and fled with her daughters. Not toward the battle, nothing could be saved there, but toward whatever refuge remained for a queen who had gambled everything and lost. The Romans didn't pursue her immediately, they had killing to finish. The field would take days to clear. Wounded who had survived the night had to be found and executed. Weapons had to be collected. Bodies had to be burned or buried, not out of respect, but because summer heat and that many corpses would breed plague within a week. Paulinus supervised the cleanup with the same efficiency he'd used to win. No triumph could be official until the enemy leader was dead or captured. Boudica was still out there somewhere, and until she was found, the victory remained incomplete. But complete enough. The largest native army in British history had been destroyed in a single afternoon. The rebellion was over. All that remained was the reckoning. The survivors scattered like seeds in a hurricane. Those who escaped the wagon trap fled in every direction, north into forests, east toward the marshes, south where rumour claimed boats might carry them to Gaul. Most didn't make it far. Roman cavalry patrols swept the roads for days, hunting fugitives with the same methodical efficiency they'd shown at the battle. Every crossroads became an execution site. Every village that had harboured warriors was burned. The smell travelled for miles. Burnt flesh, rotting corpses, smoke so thick it turned afternoon into twilight. Farmers who had stayed neutral during the rebellion emerged from hiding to find a world transformed. The roads were empty except for the dead. The markets were closed because there was no one left to trade with. Boudica's flight ended somewhere in Iceni territory. The exact location has never been determined. Historians have proposed a dozen sites, none confirmed. What's certain is that she chose death on her own terms. According to Tacitus, she took poison, a quick death, cleaner than what the Romans would have given her. Her daughters may have died with her, though the sources disagree. Some accounts say they shared the poison, others say they simply disappear from history. Their fate is uncertain as the location of their mother's grave. Historians still debate whether Boudica's suicide was courage or cowardice, both perhaps. She had seen what Romans did to captured enemies, the parades through Rome, the years of imprisonment, the eventual strangling in a dungeon beneath the Forum. She had watched what they did to her daughters once before. She would not give them the satisfaction of doing it again. The Romans never found her body. This small defiance, the denial of a trophy, infuriated Paulinus more than the rebellion itself. A Roman triumph required the defeated enemy displayed in chains. Without Boudica's corpse, the victory felt incomplete. The governor reportedly sent search parties through Iceni lands for weeks, offering rewards for information, torturing anyone who might have known something. They found nothing. The queen, who had burned 3 cities and killed 70,000 people, simply vanished from the world. Meanwhile, the Second Legion finally moved. The prefect Peneus Postumus, who had ignored Paulinus' orders to march north, learned of the Roman victory and understood what it meant for him. He had missed the defining battle of the generation. His cowardice, or caution, depending on who told the story, had kept his legion safe while others won glory. There would be no explaining this to Rome. He fell on his sword. The news spread through the army quickly. Another Roman death. This one self-inflicted, this one driven by shame rather than enemy action. Postumus had commanded over 5,000 men. If he had marched when ordered, Paulinus would have had 15,000 soldiers at the final battle instead of 10,000. The British would still have lost. The terrain guaranteed that. But the margin would have been less embarrassing, or perhaps not. Historians still debate whether more Romans would have simply meant more British dead, with no change to the outcome. Discipline beats numbers when the ground is chosen well. Postumus's legion might have done nothing except provide additional swords for the slaughter. Either way, he chose to pay for his absence with his life. Paulinus turned his attention to punishment. The rebellion had exposed something dangerous. Rome's grip on Britain was fragile. A single outrage, a single queen's humiliation, had nearly destroyed the entire province. This could never happen again. The native population had to understand that rebellion meant annihilation. The Iceni homeland became a wasteland. Roman troops marched through every settlement, burning grain stores, killing livestock, confiscating any tool that could be used as a weapon. The spring planting season had been disrupted by the war. Now the summer harvest was destroyed by policy. Famine was deliberate. Survivors who fled the destruction found no refuge. The Trinovantes were being punished just as severely. The smaller tribes who had joined the rebellion were being erased from existence, their lands redistributed to Roman veterans, their leaders executed, their names struck from official records. The system that Boudica had tried to destroy was consuming her people utterly, and Rome, watching from across the sea, began to question whether the punishment had gone too far. The final days of Boudica's life exist only in fragments and speculation. We know she survived the battle. We know she returned to Iceni territory. We know she died shortly after, by her own hand, before the Romans could find her. Everything else, the conversations, the decisions, the human moments between catastrophe and death, has been lost. Perhaps she gathered her surviving loyalists for one final council. Perhaps she sat alone in whatever shelter remained, watching the smoke rise from burning villages on the horizon. Perhaps her daughters were with her, or perhaps they had already died in the retreat. The sources contradict each other, and the truth disappeared with the woman herself. What we can reconstruct is the landscape of her failure. The army she had built was gone, not defeated in the way armies usually lose, scattered, demoralized, ready to reform with time and leadership, but annihilated. 80,000 dead in a single afternoon. The survivors were too few and too broken to mount any resistance. The rebellion that had seemed unstoppable 3 weeks earlier had been crushed so completely that it would take Britain 300 years to try again. Her people were dying, not from Roman swords now, but from Roman policy. The deliberate famine that Paulinus had imposed was beginning to bite. Stores that should have lasted through winter had been burned. Fields that should have been harvested stood empty because the farmers were dead. By the time the first frost arrived, starvation would claim more Iceni than the battle had. Her daughters had been destroyed twice, first by the rape that started everything, then by whatever happened in the chaos of the rout. If they survived, they faced a future without status, without protection, without hope. If they died, at least the suffering was over. Neither outcome offered comfort, and the Romans were coming. Paulinus had deployed cavalry units throughout eastern Britain, hunting surviving rebels with rewards for capture and punishments for concealment. Anyone who had supported Boudica, anyone who had fed her warriors or cheered her victories was subject to execution. The network of tribal alliances that had made the rebellion possible was being dismantled systematically. Historians still debate whether Boudica's suicide was inevitable or chosen. The poison was probably wolfsbane or hemlock, both common in Britain, both known to tribal healers, both capable of ending life relatively quickly. She would have known the effects: the numbness spreading from her extremities, the difficulty breathing, the gradual dimming of sensation until the body simply stopped. A queen's death, if not a warrior's. Tacitus records the fact in a single sentence. Boudica poisoned herself. No ceremony, no final speech, no dramatic confrontation with pursuing Romans, just a woman in an unknown location making the only choice left to her. The silence around her death suggests something important. She died among people who loved her enough to hide her grave. The Romans searched for years, never finding the body, never locating the burial site. That level of secrecy required coordination, loyalty, and courage from survivors who had every reason to betray her for Roman favour. They didn't. Her people protected her in death as they had failed to protect her in life. Meanwhile, Rome began debating what to do with Britain. The rebellion had been expensive. 3 cities destroyed, a legion mauled, 70,000 provincials killed. The costs would take decades to recover, and Paulinus's retribution was making things worse. Dead Britons couldn't pay taxes. Burned farms couldn't produce grain. The province that was supposed to be profitable was becoming a drain on imperial resources. Voices in Rome began questioning the entire enterprise. Emperor Nero, hardly known for restraint, reportedly sent investigators to assess whether Britain was worth keeping. The rebellion had demonstrated that the natives couldn't be trusted. The climate was miserable. The mineral wealth was proving less abundant than early reports had suggested. Perhaps the legions would be better used elsewhere. Paulinus sensed his position weakening. He had won the battle but was losing the argument. Every famine death, every executed rebel, every burnt village was being counted against him by administrators who cared more about balance sheets than military glory. The system was turning on its own saviour, and the irony was perfect. Boudica had failed to destroy Rome's grip on Britain, but she had succeeded in destroying the man who defeated her. Paulinus's victory was becoming his undoing. The harder he punished the rebellion, the more Rome questioned his judgment. He didn't know it yet, but his time in Britain was ending. Rome replaced Paulinus within a year. The new procurator, Julius Classicianus, had arrived even before the final battle's echoes had faded. His job wasn't military, it was financial, and what he found appalled him. The province was dying, not from rebellion anymore, but from the cure for rebellion. Classicianus sent reports to Rome that painted Paulinus as a liability. The governor's policies were preventing reconciliation. His massacres were creating a population with nothing left to lose. If the punishment continued, Britain would rise again, not from strength, but from desperation. People who know they will die either way sometimes choose to die fighting. Nero listened. The emperor who murdered his own mother, who would eventually burn Christians as human torches, decided that Paulinus's cruelty had gone too far. Military victory wasn't enough. The province needed to be profitable again, and that required living Britons to work and pay taxes. Paulinus was recalled to Rome. Historians still debate whether his removal was justified or political. He had saved the province after all. Without his victory at the final battle, Britain might have been lost entirely. But Rome didn't reward generals for being right. Rome rewarded generals for being useful, and Paulinus had become inconvenient. He received no triumph, no public celebration. His name appears in the records, then vanishes into the comfortable obscurity that Rome reserved for men who were too successful at the wrong time. He probably died wealthy and ignored. which was better than many commanders achieved. The Iceni fared worse. The tribe that had produced Boudica, that had ruled eastern Britain for generations, that had nearly broken Roman power, they were erased. Not all at once, but gradually, through policies designed to eliminate any possibility of future resistance. Their lands were redistributed to Roman veterans. Their noble families were executed, exiled, or reduced to commoner status. Their traditions were forbidden, their language suppressed, their gods replaced by Roman deities. Within 2 generations, the Iceni as a distinct people had ceased to exist. The Trinovanti met the same fate. The smaller tribes who had joined the rebellion were absorbed or destroyed. The entire social structure of eastern Britain was dismantled and rebuilt according to Roman specifications. This was how empires survived. Not by defeating rebellions, any army could do that, but by making rebellion unthinkable. The descendants of Boudica's warriors were taught from childhood that Romans were natural rulers, that resistance was futile, that the conquest had been for their own good. Within a century, British nobles were sending their sons to Rome for education, adopting Latin names, building villas in the Italian style they forgot, or they chose to forget, or they were never allowed to remember. The rebellion passed into myth, then into silence. For most of Roman Britain's 300-year existence, Boudica was simply absent from official memory. Her name appeared in Tacitus's histories, preserved by Roman scholars for Roman readers, but the British themselves told no stories of her. They had no stories left to tell. The famine Paulinus started continued for years after his departure. His replacement, Petronius Turpilianus, was ordered to pursue a policy of reconciliation, but reconciliation couldn't restore burned grain stores or replant destroyed orchards. The Iceni starved through 2 winters before the land recovered enough to support them. Those who survived were too weak to cause trouble. Historians still debate whether Boudica's rebellion accomplished anything at all. In the short term, nothing. Rome remained. The occupation continued. The taxes resumed. Everything she had fought for was reversed within a decade. The 70,000 Romans and provincials she killed were replaced by immigrants from other provinces. The 3 cities she destroyed were rebuilt, Londinium eventually becoming one of the largest settlements in the empire. In the long term, perhaps something. The rebellion forced Rome to reconsider its policies in Britain. The worst excesses of the procurators were curtailed. Native aristocrats were gradually allowed into the provincial administration. The occupation became slightly less brutal, slightly more collaborative, but this was small comfort to the dead, to the daughters whose rape started everything and whose fate remains unknown, to the warriors who died in the trap they should have avoided, to the families crushed beneath wagons while trying to watch a victory. The system absorbed the lesson and continued, and somewhere in Britain, in a grave that has never been found, a queen's bones rested in soil her people no longer owned. 19 centuries passed before Britain remembered its queen. The statue stands now on Westminster Bridge, bronze and defiant, Boudica driving her chariot toward the Houses of Parliament with her daughters beside her. It was erected in 1902, when the British Empire stretched across a quarter of the globe and Victoria sat on the throne. Another queen, another symbol, another woman whose name meant victory. The Victorians loved Boudica. They saw in her a precursor to their own imperial greatness, a warrior queen who embodied British courage, British determination, British refusal to submit. They put her on poems and plays and paintings. They named their battleships after her. They taught their children that she was a hero. They taught their children a lie. The daughters are on that statue standing in the chariot with their mother, frozen in bronze dignity. The statue doesn't show what was done to them. It doesn't show the rape that started the rebellion. It doesn't show the horror in their eyes as Roman soldiers took turns. The Victorian sculptors couldn't depict that, couldn't acknowledge that the symbol of British courage was forged in the systematic violation of teenage girls. The statue shows a warrior. History remembers a victim. Historians still debate whether Boudica should be celebrated at all. She killed 70,000 people, most of them civilians, many of them Britons who had chosen to cooperate with Rome. The massacres at Camulodunum and Londinium and Verulamium weren't military actions. They were ethnic cleansing. Women and children murdered for the crime of living in the wrong place at the wrong time. Does justified rage excuse atrocity? Does victimhood cancel out the victims you create? Rome never asked these questions. To Tacitus and Cassius Dio, the only writers whose accounts survive, Boudica was a curiosity, a story to tell between more important events. They preserved her because she was unusual, a woman who led armies, a native who challenged the empire, a queen who briefly made Rome afraid. They didn't preserve her because she mattered. She mattered only to the people she led, and they left no records. The Iceni had no written language. Their stories passed from mouth to ear, from generation to generation, until the generation stopped. The famine killed the elders who remembered. The occupation killed the traditions they would have passed on. The tribe itself dissolved into the Roman population, intermarrying with veterans and merchants and administrators until nothing distinctly Iceni remained. Boudica's grave has never been found. Legends place it everywhere. Beneath Platform 10 at King's Cross Station, under a McDonald's in Birmingham, in a dozen ancient mounds scattered across the Midlands. Each location is proposed with enthusiasm and abandoned with evidence. The truth is simpler and sadder. We will never find her because those who buried her made certain she would never be found. Their last act of loyalty was erasing her from the landscape. The Roman system that destroyed her endured for 3 more centuries. Britain became one of the most prosperous provinces in the empire, its cities growing, its trade flourishing, its population forgetting that they had ever been anything but Roman. When the legions finally withdrew in AD 410, they left behind a population that considered itself abandoned rather than liberated. The irony completes itself. Boudica fought to free Britain from Rome, and in the end, Britain didn't want to be free. She killed thousands, burned cities, and shook an empire. She accomplished nothing that lasted. Her victory became a massacre. Her massacre became a defeat. Her defeat became a suicide. Her suicide became a secret. The only version of her story that survives is the one her enemies wrote, and yet, she refused to submit. When they flogged her, she didn't beg. When they raped her daughters, she didn't break. When the armies gathered and the odds turned impossible, she charged anyway. The defeat doesn't erase that. The failure doesn't diminish it. Some victories are measured in outcomes, others are measured in defiance. Boudica died in a hidden grave, her body protected by people who had lost everything except their love for her. The empire that killed her eventually collapsed under its own weight. The island she tried to free eventually became the centre of another empire, one that stretched even further than Rome's, and in the end they built her a statue. They didn't build statues for her daughters. They didn't build a monument to the 80,000 who died following her. They didn't build memorials to the 70,000 she slaughtered in her rage. History remembers the queen. It forgot the price. The empire endured, the woman did not.